Good morning, good morning, friends, brothers and sisters. Welcome to another program, Clemson Brown Reporting, Tapvideo Archives. Today we have the pleasure of interviewing, talking to Brother William Seraile. And Brother William Seraile wrote a book on the, the
Theophilus,
how you pronounce that, real quick?
Theophilus,
Theophilus.
Theophilus Gould Stewart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, there's so much of our history that is missing. And while I'm on talking about Brother Seraile and his work, he's done several books. How many books have you written? Three or four?
Five.
He's written 5 books. Can you tell us the name of those 5 books?
Well, the first one was on Theophilus Gould Stewart. It's called Voice of Dissent. And it's about Diabolo Stewart in Black America. He was born in Gouldtown, New Jersey in 1843. And Gouldtown was a isolated community where there was a lot of intermarriage between about 4 or 5 families. And Theophilus was a missionary, went to South Carolina and Georgia right after the Civil War ended. Also, he went to Haiti briefly as a missionary. He was very active in the African Methodist Episcopal Church as a clergyman, and one who had beliefs that were different from the mainstream of theology at that time. And so he realized that he could not advance in the church either as a bishop or say as editor of the Christian recorded newspaper. So he joined the military as a chaplain, and he traveled out to Montana, Nebraska, Texas, and also the Philippines. I was a very gifted person. He spoke about 4 or 5 languages: French, Spanish, German, Greek, Hebrew. And he wrote about theology, but also he wrote about other issues as well. And he ended up teaching at Wilberforce University, where he died. Actually, he died the same day he was teaching in January 1924. My second other book was on Benjamin Tucker Tanner, who was also a clergyman, African Methodist Episcopal Church, who was editor of the AME Church Review, also editor of the Christian Recorder. And like Stewart, he wrote a lot about theology, but he was more conservative in his writings about theology. He had a very, very famous son, Henry O. Tanner, the artist. And if you happen to have any of his paintings, they're worth millions of dollars today. Probably the best known painting of Henry was the banjo lesson, one where a young boy is being taught how to play the banjo by older gentlemen.
I know that painting. I have it, but it's a print.
yes. Well, if you have the original, it's, like I said, it's millions of dollars. And he had a daughter named Hallie. Hallie was the first woman of any race to get a medical license to practice in Alabama. That was back in the early 1890s. My other book, third book, was actually my PhD dissertation. It's called New York's Black Regiments During the Civil War. I looked at 3 regiments, the 20th, 26th, 31st United States Colored Infantries that were formed here in New York City in 1864. And I look at the men, I look at some of their pensions, and I was told by other historians, I was the first time anybody ever looked at the pensions in connection with military people. And the pensions were very instructive because they provided information about where people live when they travel around, because they had to keep in touch with the pension bureau, but also the health issues, the marital status, their employment records, and so forth. And then my 4th book was the one we're going to discuss today on John Edward Bruce, who was born in 1856 into slavery in Maryland, and became very active as a Black nationalist and also a Pan-Africanist, involved with the likes of people like Alexander Crummell and Edward Wilmot Blyden, Booker T. Washington, Timothy Thomas Fortune, and certainly Marcus Garvey. My last book was about the Quaker women who started an orphanage for children of color in 1836 in Manhattan. And so I look at their records, which are housed in Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture, but also very extensively in the New York Historical Society. So I was able to look at the children who went through the orphanage. A lot of children were indentured at that time, which was common for all children in institutions. And a few became fairly well known. One in particular was one who wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln in 1864. And he was saying that he was a member of the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And he was basically telling the President of the United States, if we are soldiers, you need to pay us the same amount of money you're paying white soldiers. Because at that time, men in the colored regiments were receiving less money than the white soldiers. So it became a very well-known letter at that time. And as a result, eventually Congress did come out and gave these men the same salaries as they were given to the white soldiers. Now, in each case, all my research certainly involves a lot of time because you have to spend time in libraries or archives. And in all the cases, I'm looking at records that in most cases probably never were examined before. For example, when I look at the orphanage, I look at their minutes and other records, and maybe only one or two people, probably the secretary and maybe an officer, ever saw those minutes until I came along and pulled them off the shelves where they're probably dusty and caused a lot of seasoning. And the same with Theophilus' papers. His granddaughter in Ohio had 3 boxes that she never looked into. She just knew they belonged to her grandfather. So maybe one of his sons might have saw some of the letters that he had written at that time, but certainly a lot of people had never saw them until I put them together and then wrote the book. And the same is true about John Edward Bruce. His records were in the Schoenberg, and his wife gave them to Arthur Schoenberg because they were colleagues. And again, probably very few people ever saw these things until the book was published.
Brother Seraile?
Sure.
Thank you. I did not realize how extensive your work is and the topics that you have covered. It brings me to one piece that I was researching, and that is how Black soldiers played a major role in winning the Civil War and liberating themselves. And I came across a piece on Newmarket Heights where Grant had was trying to punch a hole in Robert E. Lee's line, which stretched from Petersburg to Richmond, Virginia. And it was these Black troops that was able to penetrate Robert E.'s line at Newmarket Heights. They were the one to break through with many casualties. But they broke through and they captured Richmond, Virginia, ran Robert E. Lee out, who tried to get away to hook up with his army coming out of, I think it was Tennessee. But he was captured at Newmarket Heights at Appomattox.
Yes.
And held for Grant to come down and take him. But that was all Black troops. And I know that when you talked about um, Theophilus, he was a Buffalo soldier.
Well, yes, he was the chaplain of the 25th United States Colored Infantry. He joined in 1891, and he was discharged in 1907.
Okay, so the
And
war
so
was
he was
over.
involved with the Spanish-American War
Okay,
in
but
1898.
he was a Buffalo soldier. What I was going to ask you is because I was trying to find more information on the 25th, which was an all-black
Right.
regiment. Matter of fact, it was the
Except for the officers, the white officers.
yes, and they played a important role, I think, in the Newmarket Heights penetration by black troops, which took Richmond, Virginia. I was bringing that up because they talk about Robert E. Lee and the statue and everything, but you never hear them talk about the black troops that actually captured Richmond, Virginia, and captured Robert E. Lee. And if there are any statues that should go up, it should be of the 12 or 14 black soldiers that won the Medal of Honor for their bravery in those battles that led to the capture of Richmond. And so they have a town. I went to the town. It's called Unionville, and they have I think two or three of the graves of some of the soldiers, because a lot of them settled in the area after the war, and the town is still there. There's the church there, and everything. And I was trying to bring up as much information as I could, and once I saw that Theophilus was a Buffalo soldier, I thought maybe you may know a little bit about that battle. And if
I
you
don't,
could,
not that particular battle. I mean, the records are in the National Archives, the Civil War records, and if anybody ever is interested in doing any research, particularly on say, family members who were in the Civil War, they can find what they call compiled military records, which talks about their enlistments, where they were assigned in the military, if they ever had any issues like being court-martial. You have those kinds of records, and certainly very valuable, the pension records. That's all down in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. See, a lot of times things were suppressed because during the Civil War, you had two types of white officers. You had white officers who hated being assigned to what they called colored troops, thought that was a mar on their own military records. And so in a lot of cases, they weren't willing to give them credit for achievements. Then you had other white officers who believe in ending slavery and who saw this as a test, as an opportunity to prove that black men could be fighters. And so in those cases, they were given more assignments, like to be like the military police, for example, say in Charleston after the war ended. And so a lot of stuff was just not available for the records, but they're officially available. They just weren't available, say, in the popular imagination. And that's why Du Bois, when he wrote Black Reconstruction in 1935, he said it was these men in the United States Colored Infantries, who not only saved the Union, but they saved democracy, because they showed that they could be men, and by showing they could be men, then certainly they deserved all the honors of men, like the right to hold office and the right to be voters in the elections. So there's a lot of history that's been denied us. I recall around 1938, there was a book on General Grant, and the author was saying that slaves sat under the tree playing the banjo, hoping someone would come around and give them freedom. Now that's a total denial of the nearly 200,000 African-American men who fought for the United States. And so you have other historians, and 100 years ago saying similar things, that these men were cowards. But the military records don't lie. The military records show the facts, and it's just a question of someone like myself getting into the records and looking at them, and able to give these kinds of reports. Otherwise, we just have a lot of mythology about who these men were and what they did or did not do.
Very important, because most people think that Africans brought here and enslaved, they don't give them any credit for having uh, a mind that was as curious and as explosive in terms of investigation and of both nature um, and all humanity around them. So when you begin to look at people like Frederick Douglass and Cromwell and all the people that you're written about, um, but we have very little knowledge of their work in terms of the masses of African people. So we take a lot of the image of Black people that Europeans have put out, like sitting around playing the banjo and waiting on somebody to come liberate. But that's not the case at all, which is why I wanted to spend some time with you, letting you tell us and showing us the minds of some of the brothers and sisters during that time. And they they sacrifice as much as any other people more in terms of shaping this country for whatever democracy it has. It was really a bequeath of African people's character and belief. So I wanted you to speak on that a little bit and probably expand it through the work you did, Brother Theophilus.
Well, yeah, what you're saying is certainly valid. See, again, people try to suppress accomplishments and achievements, and as a result, you get bad history. See, history is not scientific. It's not like mathematics that you can prove it's correct. History is based on interpretations of what's available, or sometimes things that are available are not revealed. They're just suppressed. And so if we were inventors, as we were, if we didn't get the credit, then the credit goes to a white person. And as a result, it's like, say, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, but did he? See, Thomas Edison came up with a contraction that gave us light, but only gave us light for a very short period of time. It's Lewis Latimer who came up with the final process that would allow us to get light that would last for hours and days and weeks. But see, all we hear about is Thomas Edison, inventing the light bulb. So you can take a lot of these inventions that we were responsible for, but then a white person is given that kind of credit. The same with exploration. We were a lot of the explorers who went across the mountains from the Midwest to the West Coast. And yet Hollywood would come up and talk about this, but they would have a white actor portraying an African-American man. So the audience would give the assumption that, oh, that was some white person who came and found a way to get across the Rocky Mountains. So things like that go down to popular history is just totally false. So someone like Theophilus or John Edward Bruce, who's writing about things that are true, it's just a question what kind of audience is being reached. And fortunately, when you have people who keep records, you keep a diary or a journal, or they have correspondence that is kept by someone in that family and preserved and then hand down to, say, to a historical society or a library for keeping, then we can go and take a look at it. One of my concerns is that we always destroy stuff. Because we may have a grandparents or a parent who kept something, but then the children or grandchildren don't think it's that relevant, and then when the person dies, they just throw it away. Who cares about those old letters? Let me give you one example. Theophilus had 7 sons, and one of his sons went to the Philippines in 1901 to teach because his father was there as a chaplain. And I saw in this person's daughter's home in Columbus, Ohio, correspondence and a journal that he had written about being in the Philippines as a young man. He was only, it's like 21 years old. And she gave her grandfather's papers to the Schoenberg, but she kept her father's papers. And then she asked me to come back a few years later to pick up her father's papers. And I said, Anna, I don't see your dad's diary for the Philippines. What happened? She said, oh, I don't know. I had some people living in my basement for a while. I don't know. It disappeared. And I had a chance to at least take a look at it briefly. And I can see here's an African-American man in the Philippines teaching Filipinos, which meant he's having observations about the culture and the social life of Filipinos. And that information is lost forever because somebody in that family was just not taking care of that kind of business. And you think about a lot of other examples of things that just get lost because things in the family people don't consider important. Now, I had 37 boxes of my personal papers, diaries and journals and correspondence and photographs and so. And I gave it to the Schoenberg not quite a year ago. I gave it to them for preservation because I know things I had would be valuable for other historians, maybe in 20, 30, 50 years from now, who want to know something about me or something about our time period. And I knew that my children, who are not historians, would have given them to the Schoenberg at some point, but they might have thrown away something they didn't think was relevant because they don't know how to make that judgment. A historian can say, hey, this is really relevant. Oh, here's a flyer, and the flyer shows that Malcolm X was speaking somewhere in 1962. All right, here's a flyer showing that there's a meeting at a public school in Harlem about South Africa situation and apartheid. Now, as soon as I saw things like that, I kept them because I would find things like that hanging out on the corner on the lamppost, and I was seeing. I would take it down and I keep it because I recognize someone's going to look at this in 50 years and say, "Oh, was there black nationalism or Pan-Africanism in Harlem, say back in the 70s or the 80s?" And yes, there was, because here's the proof. So that's the importance of maintaining these kinds of things. So someone like Theophilus had 3 boxes of papers and letters and journals and correspondence that helped me to go back and look at it, and then I add to it other records I could locate and tell a story. The story was his story, and in part it was our story.
Now, through the works that you have done, your research, how involved have Africans in America been in the liberation struggle of Africa? I mean, looking at Theophilus, who went to Haiti, but he also had a great interest in African liberation as well.
Well, what you have, what you have is the contacts, because someone like Bruce, John Everett Bruce, had correspondence. He never went to Africa himself. John Everett Bruce. Garvey wanted to send him there as part of a delegation, but at that time, Bruce said his health wasn't strong enough, and he thought it'd be better for a younger person to go. But Bruce had correspondence with people in Liberia and Sierra Leone, Ghana, or what was then called the Gold Coast, and Nigeria. And he had correspondence about economic development, certainly correspondence about politics and independence. See, what we have to keep in mind is that we, as African people, we're the best educated in the African world. We took advantage of opportunities that were here, so we're the best educated. And we had a lot of people back over 100 years ago was saying we need to have that kind of alliance with Africa. We need to help develop the economic resources. Unfortunately, some of us were not that had that kind of foresight to think of possibilities, so we didn't think about it. And I'm talking about the period before Europeans came in, before like the 1890s, or when Europeans started coming in to colonize much of Africa. And we were trying to have economic connections between Africa and ourselves. So you can imagine what could have happened if we had that kind of ambition at that time to take some of our resources here and to apply them to the African continent for development. Because we all know Africa is very, very wealthy. That's why Europeans went there, because they can get the gold and the diamonds and the other minerals for industrialization. So they went to exploit. And we had the opportunity to go to assist, but some of us got too tied up in being Americanized and didn't understand the reality of this kind of international cooperation. So again, we always had people had the interest either going to Africa as immigrants themselves or trying to develop some of these economic ties with Africa.
Let me ask you your historical background.
My personal background?
No, I'm just formulating a question
Okay,
that that I want you to answer,
sure.
and that is, we seem to have lost so much of our history, and I'm talking about most of our young people today really don't have any idea of our historical past, our contributions, our relationship in America. They may not even know slave acts and black codes and how it come about and all of that. Now, I say we have to build a platform, no matter whether you're a Democratic or Republican, because if you do not prepare for the future, someone else will prepare your future for you. And it's not going to be a liberated African people unless we can create or lay out our own platform where we want to be in the next 10 years, 20 years, whether it's business relationships with Africa, educational, and so forth. But we have to lay it out. So I wanted you, out of your wisdom and research, to give us what you see should be a platform that we should put forth, and particularly at this time when you have African Americans saving the Union, as we have done so many other times, but always been forgotten after the election and so forth. What should be our stance? What should be our platform? What should
Well,
we be
yeah,
reaching?
I think first we got to recognize why we were here in the first place. We came here because we had knowledge, so we knew how to grow things like cotton and rice, how to take care of cattle. So we had those skills. Otherwise, why bring us? We knew how to do the farming. So we came and we served a purpose, and that purpose was to develop economically the United States. Now the question is, what is our purpose to white people today? And I think part of the answer is to put us in prison because they don't want us around. And so I think that the purpose should be what we call think of ourselves as a race first people. I mean, that's what Garvey was talking about, and certainly other people in the 19th century were talking about race first. Now, what does it mean to say race first? Well, race first means that we think of how can we advance as a people. Let me give you an example. I live in Harlem. Almost every establishment in Harlem is owned by someone who wasn't born in Harlem. They were born in other countries. It could be the Middle East, or it could be Dominican Republic. Before it was Korea. So you had to ask the question: why are all these people in Harlem? Well, Malcolm X said Harlem is only poor because money doesn't stay in Harlem. It leaves in the hands of people who don't live here, who just come here to make a living, to make money. So when you say first, like race first, it means how can we individually acknowledge this? Well, everybody spends money on something. Whether you spend money on a doctor, a dentist, a lawyer, a tax consultant, the question is, who do we choose? So we choose among ourselves. We're trying to keep the money among ourselves, which will help to expand our own personal and community economics. So that's just one simple example. If we we talked about this before. See, the problem with history is that we do things, but then we forget that we did it. So Booker T. Washington had a plan. His plan was the National Negro Business League. They started in 1900. And the thing was to have branches all throughout the country where we lived. So we knew where to go. So we needed a carpenter, we needed a bricklayer, we needed an electrician. We had a list of people we could go to. And so therefore the money would stay among ourselves. But what happens after a while, white people get smart and say, how can we get some of that money? See? I recall like in the late 60s, someone like Ebony Magazine would have advertisements, and they would have the big question, or they have the statement, we too have money. And what they were saying, they were telling corporate America, we have money, so why can't you advertise with us? So advertise, you know, Coca-Cola or ginger ale or your automobiles or your furniture in our magazine, because we have the money, which means we have money to give you. See? So that means that others are thinking, how can they take this money away from us? And we kind of fall for that. So we end up putting our money in other people's pockets. And that's why I'm saying, if I go out to buy a newspaper or I go out to buy a cup of coffee in Harlem, I'm not going to see someone who looks like me who's going to serve me. It's somebody else. If I go to Dunkin's Donuts, people come from Bangladesh. Because they seem to operate a lot of the Dunkin' Donuts, certainly in Manhattan. I even go to my corner to buy some fruit, and the guys from Bangladesh. See? Because they had their money and they put their money together in order to have economic development for themselves. And very little of that money is going to filter down to our community. So I think if you think of race first and how to apply it, then we can go forward. I always told my students, you ever see in Chinatown, black people selling something? They said, no. I said, you know why, don't you? Because Chinese are going to dominate whatever goes on in Chinatown in terms of the pharmacies, the stores, anything is Chinese. But you can come to Harlem, you can see everybody. Everybody comes to Harlem to make money. And then they leave because, see, their point is not to stay here. Their point is to come here X years, whether it's 5, 10, or 20, and then leave because they accumulate what they want. Then they can either go back home or they can stay here and do something that's more lucrative. But meanwhile, they were in Harlem. So I've been in Harlem since 1974 as a resident, and I've seen different ethnic groups in Harlem operating the stores, where they're selling fish or hamburgers. But as I said, they come and they stay for a while, and then they accumulate what they need, and then they go to something that's more lucrative for them, and then they're replaced by somebody else. So I think, see, a race first concept is this. I remember years ago, there were Koreans in Harlem and Brooklyn, elsewhere, who had the small stores, and they would sell the fruit and vegetables and so forth. And there were some times in which people got upset with the behavior of the Koreans, and they started to boycott. You might get 30, 40, 50 people come out on a regular basis, and they would have signs, "Don't shop here." They insulted us. And after a while, the Koreans who had those establishments would close up, and the place remained vacated for months at a time. And then what happened next? Somebody else came, maybe some other Koreans came and sold the same things that were being sold previously. So how come the people who were boycotting for weeks at a time, why didn't they say, hey, there's enough of us to put money together so we can take over and sell the same products that we buy? See, to me, that's a race first concept, but you have to get indoctrinated, as a way of speaking, to think that way. And we don't think that way. And we don't think that way, then we're not going to do what Booker T. Washington said about having a national league of business, or what Garvey was saying too. Garvey is trying to do the same thing, because Garvey was a disciple of Booker T. Washington in terms of economics. And Garvey tried to do the same thing. And the minister, Elijah Muhammad, did the same thing for a while. And Malcolm X talked about this. And then what happens? All of a sudden we forget. We forget these people, and we forget what they were trying to accomplish. Then we ask the question, what's wrong with us? Well, his life story is, like I said, he was born in 1856 into slavery in Maryland, same year that Booker T. Washington was born. And so was Timothy Thomas Fortune, who was editor of New York Age, and also involved with Marcus Garvey and Booker T. He was a slave, but his mother was very enterprising. She would sell whatever she could to the soldiers in Maryland, the soldiers from the United States military. So in a way, they just kind of just walked for freedom. And the war ended, when he was very young. And so he's a hustler. He was a hustler. He would go out and find odd jobs, and he got involved in journalism. He worked for a number of newspapers. He himself was owner or editor of several newspapers. And he did this throughout the latter part of the 19th century. Became very interested in Africa, because he had correspondence with both Alexander Cornell, who had lived in Liberia for a number of years, and with Edward Wilmot Blyden, who also lived in Africa. And so through those men, he had an interest in Africa, and he also had correspondence with many people in West Africa. And then he was involved with Booker T. Washington as a writer for a short time period, but then he got disillusioned with Booker T. and just became more in line with Du Bois and Monroe Trotter up in Boston, as people like anti-Booker T. Washington's philosophy of accommodation. And he got involved with Marcus Garvey. At first, he thought Garvey was a con man, but then he said one cold winter evening, he heard Garvey speaking, and something struck him. And he said he made more sense than everybody else at that time. He made more sense than A. Philip Randolph or Chandler Owen or anyone else on the scene, whether they were socialists or nationalists. So he became very much involved with Garvey. And he probably had a great influence on Garvey's having an interest in economics in Africa, since Bruce knew these people through correspondence, and in some cases even in person, because some of the officials from Liberia came to Bruce's home in Yonkers. And so he had those contacts. So I'm sure he told Garvey of the wisdom of economic connections with Africa and the Garvey movement. So he was very active in Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism. And fortunately, his papers, a lot of correspondence, because at one time, his collection in Schoenberg was the largest holding that they had. And fortunately, his widow was able to give it to Arthur Schoenberg, because Bruce and Schoenberg were friends. They had, in fact, established in 1911 the Negro Society for Historical Research in Yonkers, New York, because they both recognized the importance of research and more importantly, the dissemination of that kind of research. And they didn't last that long, because Carter Woodson came around in 1915 with the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And Woodson was better educated. He had a degree from Harvard, and certainly better organized to reach out in order to get people to help him with his enterprise. But John Everett Bruce was certainly important, and unfortunately, a lot of people like John Everett Bruce have very important lives, and then they kind of get forgotten as time goes by, because we have a tendency not to try to do what they suggested that we should have done at that time, and certainly to follow up in our time.
Thank you. Somehow my mind went off on trying to establish a platform, and I wanted you to help me form that platform so that we can have a direction to put out there that goes beyond the selection. And also, if you want participation from African Americans, it has to be a two-way street, but we need a platform of what we want to bring about for our support and our work to make sure that whatever group, whether it's Democratic or Republican, gets in the office, they will execute a platform that African Americans put forth that
Well, again,
empowers.
see, Mr. Brown, again, we have to give rewards and give out punishments. So if a politician says, elect me, and if you elect me, I'll do this, and they don't, then we need to punish. And a lot of times we just get caught up in the election and not the follow-up. And so let me give you an example. Andrew Young was United States ambassador to the United Nations some years ago.
Yeah.
And he made some comments that were perceived by some people as being anti-Israel. What happened next? He had to apologize. He had to apologize.
Yeah.
Because Jewish people did not like what he said, because he was saying something that they consider anti-Israel. Same thing happened with Jesse Jackson. He said something about New York City being basically being a Jewish town, like Jew. Yeah. I think that includes the word Jaime town. And he had to apologize because he understood the power of people had over him, in the sense they can withhold money, they can write letters to the editors and so forth. So we don't think that way. We just think, oh, I helped so-and-so become president or governor or mayor, and we don't think that way. So what we need to do is, we talk about education. We don't need more leadership in the sense of new ideas. What we need to do is follow the old ideas. So we have enough people historically who told us what to do and how to do it. We need to go back and study those people, because if we do, then we have the answers. But you have to have forums. We did this before. I mean, historically, we've had these lyceums and forums where we educated people who were not being educated anyplace else. So it could be in a church, it could be like the Wise, it could be in somebody's home where you have a study group and you talk about who was Booker T. Washington, what did he do, what do you accept? So I always tell people, you don't have to accept 100% of anybody. You might accept 20%, maybe 50%, maybe 80%, maybe 5%. But whatever you accept is something that's going to have us go forward. So you can always find fault. You can find fault with everybody and say, well, I reject them 100%. You don't have to. Just accept what you can and what you can't. You leave to the side. So there's enough in Booker T. Washington's platforms about development economically that we could emulate. The same with Marcus Garvey, same with Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, and others. But we don't know this stuff, so we don't know it. Then how are we going to do anything? See?
Correct.
And
right.
so once and only you're going to know this if you have it. If it's not offered in the public schools, then do it. I knew my daughter went to high school with one of her friends background was Japanese. And the friend, she's a teenager, said, "Oh, I hate going to Japanese school on Saturdays." And what she hated was learning about Japanese culture and language. And I said to her, "You just wait. One day you're going to become a mother, and you're going to have your daughter or son going to Japanese schools too, because you're going to realize the importance of trying to maintain that culture." See? And so you have people going to Hebrew school or Chinese school or Japanese school or any other schools, not in school, but on the weekend, on a Saturday or a Sunday, because their community want them to maintain those kinds of connections. We don't. So then if we don't do it, then we can see how we get easily manipulated. And as a result, we ask these questions. How come we can't? And so I think that, again, going back to your platform, look at people like John Edward Bruce and see what did he do, what did he advocate. See, what Bruce, for example, Bruce started, like I said, the Negro Society for Historical Research in Yonkers with Arthur Schoenberg. Their plan was to have scholarship, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, where people could do the research, present papers. And all they were doing is the same thing that was done in 1897. The American Negro Academy, started by people like Alexander Crummell and Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Diabolo Stewart, and many others. Same thing. We have scholarship. Let's present it. Let's have a forum. Let's have a program. Invite the audience and present this stuff. And the same thing that was done and still being done by Carter Woodson Association. So today you have the Association for the Study of African American Life and History that was started by Carter Woodson in 1915. Same thing. They have programs, try to tell people so we can learn from these kinds of past achievers. And we can, then we have at least a basis to say, this is what we need to go forward with. Otherwise, all we're going to do is become educated, but educated for the wrong reasons and to serve somebody else.
Correct.
Let me give you another example. Prior to the civil rights movement, we were shut out of a lot of industries, a lot of jobs because of discrimination. Until we began to realize that when we had the money, so we, like Ebony Magazine say, hey, check us out, we have money too. So we can start buying some of those products. But also when they realized that we had skills because we're not going to college and we're taking courses in areas that we weren't before. So now we had knowledge of, say, things like advertisement and mathematics and so on. And so they began to tap into our communities to take people away. So if you have an advertiser and the advertiser saying, oh yeah, they have money too, how can we reach that audience? Well, let's find some black man or woman who pretty good with music. Let them tell us what kind of music we should play with our advertisements. And that's why you pay attention. Everybody from McDonald's to Coca-Cola to Kentucky Fried Chicken, they use our music. They use our music because they know our music is going to attract people, and you attract people, they'll hear your message. So they go out and buy your hot dogs and your hamburgers and your cheeseburgers and your pizzas because the music brings them in.
Correct.
without music.
Right.
See, but we don't realize these things. We just oh, that's nice. I remember that song. That was a great song. But meanwhile, we're buying the products.
Mm-hmm.
See, so we don't know the role that other people used against us in order to entice us. And don't we even know these kinds of things if we have these, say, like forums where on a Saturday we have children throughout the country and we tell them about our culture and about our history so they understand what they should be doing.
Correct.
That's a problem that we haven't addressed. See, we're in America, and America talks about me, 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 me. I mean, even advertisement like "you deserve a break today," see, or you deserve Johnny Walker. You know, so make it all individuals. Whereas in Africa, is more us. It's the collection of people. It's not just me, me, me. So see, me can go ahead, me can go forward and be successful, but the rest of us are being helped backwards. So as a result, we're not moving forward, not making that kind of progress that we should make. See, again, we did these things before. See, we're the ones who organize everything from churches to benevolent societies to burial societies because we had to depend upon ourselves during the time period of segregation and racism. So we did these things. And we know Africans do these things because Africans come here and they have organized among themselves. So if somebody dies here, the body is sent back to Senegal or Ghana because they already established this is our role outside of Africa. So we put money aside. Everybody putting money every month. So if someone dies and needs $2,000, they have it. So they don't necessarily run to Chase or to another bank and try to beg for a loan. They already have the money set aside because they plan in advance for these kinds of activities. And a lot of times we don't. See, so as a result, we find ourselves begging. So we need to look at history and look at those who made the history and don't forget them. Say, what can I gain by looking at these people, what they had in mind? And see, a lot of people, see, they left their records because I have in my library here, I have 13 volumes of Booker T. Washington's papers. And I'm sure there's more on Booker T. Washington in the Library of Congress, but a historian went through the papers and he decided what he thought was relevant, and it ends up in 13 volumes. And I can go to those volumes and I can see correspondence between Booker T and other people. I can see where he's organizing the National Negro Business League, and I can learn from that. I have multiple volumes of Marcus Garvey's papers, the same thing. I can see what Garvey was doing 100 years ago and what he was trying to accomplish. And I had the same thing on Frederick Douglass. I have several volumes on Frederick Douglass of his correspondence and his speeches. So we can learn from these people. It's not like they live and they died and we don't know anything about them.
No, that is so true. And when you look at Booker T. Washington, and I'm not getting away from Cromwell, if you can add anything, please do in relationship to how they saw what we needed to be doing. And they laid it out, as you say, they had forums and so forth. And they were leaders to actually lay out a plan that would ultimately get us in a situation where we were more in control of our destiny. And you'll find that there were over 100 independent Black communities that were successful. Black Wall Street was not the only community that Black people had that was very successful. They were all across the country, and but we don't see how we interacted and how we built those communities and how we maintained them. and how we have to go back to them today. We have to go back to that models of self-sufficiency, feeding ourselves, for an example. There are, in terms of building hydroponic farming institutions that we control, that we can grow all the food we need without pesticides and so forth. And Tuskegee Institution was a great institution on agricultural science. And especially Booker T. Washington, who saved the South because of his scientific understanding of the relationship between the soil and nature, and what nature pull out of what plants pull out of the soil, and what plants you need to replant to rebuild. We don't we don't have that specialization uh, that came out of institutions that were built by Black folk, like Tuskegee Institution today. But we need them today more than ever, because technology is the driving force that will determine the future for humanity. And if
Yeah.
we're going to be sitting at the table, um, then we have to have a plan where we actually needed at the table, and demand that we are at the table. And that will happen only if we prepare ourselves for that kind of leadership. The world needs that leadership. So, um, you know, I'm this has been a pleasure speaking with you and going back over uh, what our ancestors built, and the way they saw our liberation struggle, going back to before the Civil War. Because people have an idea that Black folk didn't do anything but work from sun up to sundown without pay, doing whatever the master told us. But uh, you've given us a different view of that. So I want to more than thank you. Uh, I look forward to another interview with you. This hour has passed by so fast.
So do you have any final questions on John Edward Bruce? That's
Yes,
like,
please, please, please.
well, I'm not, you know, if you had a specific question about some of his ideologies or not, because uh, he's not that well known. I mean, my book, actually, there's another book also on him that came out after mine. We obviously we use the same resources, but I had a few extra outlets for sources that he didn't have, the other author. So I have a slightly different interpretation of his accomplishments in his lifetime. But John Edward Bruce, again, he was very devoted to race concepts. Schoenberg, after Bruce had died, Schoenberg had said that Bruce, like, he lived and ate and died Negro, because he at that time the term Negro was popularized back in the 1870s by Edward Wilmot Blyden as a term to replace the term colored, because colored was used starting back in the 1830s, and basically it meant people who wanted to assimilate into America, to integrate. And so people like Alexander Crummell and Blyden, who were into Pan-Africanism, felt that Negro was a more representative term. It represented more of the physical look of an African, with the nose and the mouth and so forth. And so you had this movement that was supported by Bruce. So when Schoenberg said that Bruce had lived and ate and everything else Negro, he was saying he's a man who was full of pride in his Africanness. And certainly Garvey believed that as well. And so when Bruce is talking about developments, he knew that Africa had the resources. It's just a question of how do you develop those resources. And so he was interested, as others were, use some of our scientists, because we had people who study in colleges like Tuskegee, and they had the knowledge of the soil, but also they had knowledge of chemistries, and they had knowledge of minerals. And so he was interested in trying to see if we could develop those kinds of connections where we can use money that we had here as investment to help develop what Africa had. And unfortunately, a lot of people saying, well, I ain't no African. I don't know nothing about no Africa. And so they didn't see the connections. So they're just more, I'm here in America, and this is where I am. And so if you don't see the connection, then you're not going to reach out and try to develop those kinds of relationships. Obviously, Garvey saw this, and this is why Garvey found that Bruce was really important in his organization, not only as a journalist, but also as a person who had those contacts with these people in Ghana and Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria. And so that's why we need to try to know more about people like John Edward Bruce. Bruce also was very, very interested in politics. He was a Republican because in those days, the Democratic Party was associated with Ku Klux Klan and slavery and segregation. So like many others, he was a member of the Republican Party, but also he was critical of the Republican Party because he realized after time, Republican Party was only interested more in the votes and less interested in protection, giving protection to those of us who live in the South from discrimination. So he was critical, and so he spoke about this. He wrote about it to say we don't need to be 100% married to the Republican Party. We need to challenge the Republican Party. And so by the time he died, he was more disillusioned of the Republican than he was supportive. And he's trying to tell other people you need to look. Because see, again, we have people who were talking about this in the 1880s, 1890s. We need to get out of allegiance to a party. We need to have an independent political party. And that was mainly the work of Timothy Thomas Fortune, who also was born into slavery in Florida in 1856, and who at one time was editor of the New York Globe, the New York Freeman, and then certainly with the New York Age. And he was talking about political independence, because he said otherwise what happens is we get a few people who get appointed to prestigious positions. You see, in the latter part of the 19th century, Republican parties would appoint African-American men to certain government positions, like postmasters of small towns, the secretary, the treasury, to the Department of Treasury, to be the diplomats to Haiti or Liberia, recorder of the deeds, which would be like a city clerk in Washington. That's a job that Frederick Douglass held for a number of years. So these are jobs that we were appointed to automatically because we were supporters of Republican. And so we would be certainly in favor of having Republicans as president of the United States. And so you can get people, politicians, Frederick Douglass or John R. Lynch or Blanche Bruce or others to go out and say, yes, vote for whoever the candidate was for the Republican Party, because they knew that they or their friends would be appointed to these government positions. But what they're not doing is saying, we want the Republican Party to look out for us. And for us meant look out and to stop the lynchings. Because lynchings were very common in that part of the country in the South and even other parts outside, certainly throughout the 1880s and 90s, up and down to the 1940s. So if the Republican Party doesn't look out and try to do something about lynchings, see, the United States had never passed an anti-lynching law. Never. There have been efforts, but they never were able to get both branches of Congress to support it. Even today, there's no anti-lynching law, even though Recently, we had several senators, African-American senators, including the one from South Carolina, who gave support, but we didn't get the votes yet to make lynching a federal crime. And so they were saying back then, you got to look at lynchings and you have to look at discrimination, segregation. And Republican Party say, well, no, we don't want to alienate people who might vote for us. And so consequently, what happened was we had people who get appointed, but the masses would still suffer because we're not looking out for the masses, just looking out for individuals to have those kinds of federal lucrative appointments.
Let me ask you: is the law a black man has no rights that a white man has to respect?
That was a Supreme Court decision, 1857.
Yes, is that still good law?
Yeah.
Because it was never appealed or anything.
It still exists because what happens is that people say, well, discrimination is dying out and is almost gone and get over it and stuff. But see, they don't see discrimination in the terms that aren't that visible. See, what they see is you can't eat here or you can't work here. That's a very open sign of segregation or discrimination. You don't see that because there are laws against it. What you don't see is if you go to the hospital, you may not get the same diagnosis, the same treatment as, say, a white person. You may say, oh, take some aspirins and go home. You go home and then you die a couple of days later because they didn't take time to really find out what was wrong with you. Or they don't see, if I go into a restaurant and sit down and all of a sudden someone's going to accuse me of stealing something, see, or they don't see the fact that a white person could be driving their car and get stopped by the police, and the white person gets angry with the police for stopping them and start cursing them, and nothing happens, but we get stopped and say nothing and still might get shot. See, so that means that there's two levels of respect or lack of respect. And so things like that happen, and then we're the victims. And so it's just like this recent case of a 14-year-old boy who was accused of this 22-year-old white girl of stealing her phone that she had accidentally left in a car that was returned to the hotel where they were staying. And she automatically accused him and demanded her phone back. She would never done that for a white man. She might say, I lost my phone. Did you see my phone? She's not going to come out and say, where's my phone? Give me my phone back. That kind of stuff happens all the time. So people may not see these things taking place. They just say, oh, I don't see the racism. I don't see it. Well, you don't see it because it's not there in the terms that you used to see it. It's in terms that always existed, and we overlook the fact that we see it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Mr. Brown, if you go to the store and if a white person is standing 5 feet away from you and the cashier looks at the white person and says, yes, may I help you? And they see that you were there before, and they don't say to you, oh, sir, yes, are you ready, sir? See, they'll take care of that white person. Well, that happens all the time.
Correct.
And another white person who may be right there too, don't even see it. See, they don't see the fact that you were ignored. They just see another person being served, and they wait their turn.
Right. Correct. Brother Seraile, I want to thank you. It's been a good interview, and I hope we can extend this and that I can call upon you again.
Sure. I just want to leave you with a couple of things. So one, as I always tell people when I give any kind of a lecture, we have to save the records, historical records, because we don't realize what it means to someone like myself to have records whether they're family photographs, whether they're correspondence, flyers for programs. All this stuff collectively helps us tell a story. And everything I've written is based on someone's saving something. So I could not have written my 5 books without the records. Now, I did see recently you had Perry on, talked about Hubert Harrison. And he has a huge collection that referred to Hubert Harrison. Someone saved those records. Otherwise, he couldn't have told the story that he has told and still telling. So I tell people to save records, and see, people might say, oh, that's not really important. Well, it's not your judgment, it's my judgment. It's the judgment of archivists and places like historical societies or public libraries that have the ability to preserve things. Let me give you an example. Once I took to the Schoenberg some photographs that were given to me by someone of a friend who had died. The woman was very elderly and she had died. She had some old photographs. The person said, can you take this to the Schoenberg? Maybe they can use it. So I took them to the Schoenberg, and I happened to mention to the person in charge of the photos, I said, oh, I didn't bring a couple because it just shows somebody sitting around in a chair in a bathing suit. What? Why didn't you bring that one too? Is that important? Yes, it's important because we learned something about fashion. What kind of bathing suits the person was wearing. So
Yeah.
I never thought to say, if you learn about fashion, and that was something like in the 50s, yeah, we see what kind of bathing suit the person was wearing, and in other words, it's relevant, even though I didn't think it was relevant. So see, I wasn't positioned to make that judgment, but this person who understood photographs knew that was relevant. And so things like that. It's just like if you have a family member who came here in the 1920s or 30s from Barbados or Trinidad or Jamaica, and they left family members back, and they're writing letters about what it's like living in New York City, Brooklyn, or Harlem, 100 years ago. And maybe nothing more than about, I walked down the street and I went to get some ice cream or something, and they're just describing something in the streets. And someone later on say, that's really valuable because we don't know much about people's social life 100 years ago in, say, Harlem, outside of like going to the clubs. We don't know what they did, like an everyday kind of thing on a Sunday. So that letter is really valuable. I have a letter from Theophilus to his son when his son became 21 years old. And the letter basically is saying, today you are a man, today you have responsibilities, you have to live up to your family's name, basically don't mess up, kid. Nothing about, hey boy, I love you, I'm so glad to see that you have grown up to a young man, and so forth. I mean, nothing about a father's love, is all about responsibility. So that tells us something about how fathers interacted with sons in 1901. So, and he wouldn't have known that, but see, that was in a letter. The letter was saved. It becomes part of his collections, and now it's part of the Schoenberg's collections. And I have, just for examples, I have, like I said, I gave 37 boxes to the Schoenberg for my records. And going through things, I came across a flyer that said, Trump, stay out of Harlem. When Trump was trying to buy or develop in Harlem back in the 80s, there was some meeting and the results were, stay out of Harlem, Trump. That's on the flyer.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's something I totally forgot about because it's something I found somewhere, probably on a lamppost. I just took it off because it was after the meeting date of that flyer. And I have flyers that, have things like Robert Mugabe is coming to Harlem. Give a date, it might be sometime in the 80s. Or is anti-apartheid meeting at Harriet Tubman School in Harlem. And things like that so long ago, 30, 40 years ago, but then a historian would say, were people in Harlem active in the Pan-African movement? Yes. Well, here's a flyer and other flyers showing that there were meetings on a regular basis to show support for the Africans in South Africa in the fight against racism. So you have stuff like that now. So by itself, it may not amount to too much, but take that and you add it to other collections and other letters and documents, then you're able to tell a story. So I always tell people, look at what you have, don't throw it away, and certainly take it someplace. Say, hey, to the Schoenberg, hey, I have these old letters from my grandparents written back in 1910. Can you tell me, is this something you want? And they say, yeah, this is really important. Or they might say, no, you got to keep that. That's just personal. But let them tell you that. And the same with the photographs or anything else. If you go to New York Historical Society, and let's say you're doing a movie about the 1890s, and you have a scene in a restaurant, you go to New York Historical Society and you say, oh, do you have any menus from restaurants in the 1890s? And they do. So you see exactly what was the cost of steak or pork chops or anything in the 1890s in a restaurant, because they have the menus. They save those things.
Yes.
Now, that may not be important to you, but it's important to someone making a movie about the 1890s to try to be more authentic. And that's why you see these old movies, you see how people are dressed, because someone went to a magazine that was saved that shows dresses for sale or suits for sale, and they can see exactly how they were, so they can have a seamstress make the same things, for a play or make it for a movie to try to be authentic. That's history. And then my other thing I always like to tell people is to study, to read history. And we can't say it's being kept from us because it's available. It's available. It's available in libraries, and available in bookstores. Read. And if you read, then you have more insights, and insights would make you more knowledgeable. And being more knowledgeable might lead to action.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. Let me ask you another question on Theophilus, because he went to Haiti,
Yeah.
and you speak about his, I'm going to say, disappointment with some of the things that were going on in Haiti. He described that he described the racism in Haiti. How should I put this? Um, the way, even though Haiti had done tremendous things that had not been done by any people in terms of its revolution and its defeating the French, the Spaniards, and the English as a slave
Right.
uh, army.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, after having won the war and everything, they still look to white people as I don't know, superior race, in that they advocated marriage of their women, their daughters, to white men. Uh, Now, I think I got that from your
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah. Well,
Can you
see,
can you talk about that a little bit?
sure. See, that's just part of the cultural of what's the word? It's a cultural dominance, and if all you see is whiteness as being superior, then you want to emulate whiteness, whether it's in Africa or the Caribbean or India, any place else. So you say the white skin is best. So if I'm close to the white skin and color, then I'm more superior. So a lot of times in these cultures, you find people who are light complexion, who are racially mixed, but they're lighter in complexion than the average person, so they're elevated higher up. And so somehow it feels like I made it in a way, because I have a white person, particularly say a white woman, as my bride. Just slightly to a side, Malcolm X one of the ministers in the Nation of Islam was talking about Malcolm after Malcolm had left the nation. And he said, Malcolm was chosen by Elijah Muhammad because he had the right height and the right complexion or color. And it was, he said it and he just went right past it. And I'm thinking, if he said Malcolm had the right color, he means Malcolm was light in complexion, and which meant in somebody's mind, that meant he was better. He was maybe more intelligent. I mean, I thought about that. And so it's a thing that has happened throughout the world because Europeans had the domination and people thought they were better looking, smarter, etc. You know, just it's international because in Vietnam, the women in Vietnam would be covered from their neck to their ankles, so you don't see their skin. You really don't see much of their face because they have a large covering over their head as well, because they didn't want to look like Cambodians. Cambodians are darker in complexion, and they got that from the French because they're trying to be lighter in their own culture. And so in Haiti, the same thing. If you could marry a European person, you were going higher up.
Okay.
And unfortunately, we use this among ourselves, and somehow people quote, they put together, I'm successful now because I have a partner who's white. And they overlook the fact that that partner who is white may not be the best partner for you.
Correct. Right. Brother Seraile,
Yes.
again, I want to thank you, and it's been a great morning and a great interview.